At the threshold of the third millennium, the nation-state faces a conflict involving a multiplicity of powers, which call into question its fundamental values, delegitimizing that political authority rooted over the years, which had made it become a political and cultural reference point for the Western countries. External pressures by the international actors, often the main players in globalization, are more and more awakening central powers, along with those internal realities which claim their cultural and political individuality. Particularly, ethnic minorities movements are the fiercer and often violent expression of that anti-national feeling aiming to defeat the founding principles of the 19th-20th century state sovereignty, whose blurring boundaries have become mere signs outlined on the maps. The scathing criticism leveled at the idea of nation-state led to the necessary evaluation of claims to secession, even from a legal point of view. The mere recognition of the demands supported by those minorities is no longer sufficient to ensure territorial unity. Instead, a definition of a broader political scope suitable to allow the sharing of a single political project is what is called for. Nor the recognition by the international community of those new state entities posting from an original state without prior assessment of the motivations underlying secession is a valid means for addressing the issue we are dealing with. It is therefore appropriate to assess the legal aspects recognized by the international community that are coessential with the self-determination principle and secession when necessary for the same principle to be recognized. The legal solutions proposed at an international level in order to set the conflict between the assurance of the sovereign borders and people's self-determination resolved in the enforcement of a state's territorial integrity principle against the claims of its minorities. A specific regime concerning the protection of minorities, established after the First World War, resumed later in the criterion of the United Nations Charter in accordance with the values of peace and protection of fundamental human rights. The subsequent secession events, particularly those after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, concerned old questions already aroused in the international community at the end of the First World War. However, a secession also involves the institution of new states, in particular those established as a consequence of important geopolitical revolutions, such as, for example, the dismembering of multinational empires, decolonization, multi-ethnic countries emerged after the disintegration of former Soviet bloc. The examination of the recognition process of population self-determination principle within the drafting of the international legislative texts denotes the compromised nature of the adopted solutions, often not faithfully representing the level of evolution achieved in the relation between principles. Even the states that did not recognize self-determination as a principle to be granted later did accept the vast and unclear notion so that the principle could interlace with minority rights and fundamental human rights. After the First World War onward, secessionist and separatist movements were considered as a factor for international relations instability and a threat to peace and security, ensuing the impossibility to legitimate the implementation of self-determination rights under any circumstance. The adopted solutions aim to establish the condition to ensure minorities' protection within the borders of the sovereign states, to the point that the protection of minorities has been absorbed and incorporated in the protection of fundamental human rights, thus acquiring an individualistic significance, also capable of concerning self-determination from an internal point of view. In the last few years, integration at European level has seen an increase in participation by the different national and territorial organizations in the community policies. However, unsolved issues dating back to the collapse of the central powers or even more ancient ones originating from the history of a specific territorial context, re-erupted when the greater involvement required by the international actors fostered the legitimate aspirations of the parties concerned to express their will. Maximum decentralization as an expression of the subsidiarity principle provides new instruments to those local authorities more firmly requesting and have a higher degree of autonomy, that is frequently opposed to claims and expectations of the national states, as happened, for example, with Scotland and Catalonia. Recently, and in previous periods, similar efforts toward independence also occurred in territories that are not included in the European community, such as ex-Yugoslavia and the Crimean Peninsula. However, in these territories, such efforts arose through violent and radical forms that resulted into fierce conflicts involving ethnic groups and populations which until then had been sharing the same territory. National and independence claims take different forms depending on the region in which they take place. In countries belonging to the European Union, where democratic procedures have been implemented since a long time, the participation in the political and institutional process turns into calls for outright independence, questioning national borders and advancing the borderlines of new geographical areas, which represent the aspirations of ancient communities, as shown in the case of Scotland and Catalonia, where cultural, political and social traditions promote new institution founding projects, though the peaceful and democratic endorsement by the peoples involved, as well as the organization holders of different interests, would be required. Otherwise, in those areas where a population lacks an active role in policy decisions and is often suffering from the consequences imposed by the historical events, the founding will is expressed through violence and destruction, and the emergence of new states is not celebrated by crowds of community consent, but it is rather announced by the disturbing thunder of guns.